But anyway, Joe is a retired investment advisor to endowments and foundations and a private equity investor. He previously served as the director of the PQ Corporation, that's in silicates and glass bead manufacturer, and the Femco Holding Company, machine shops and machine service. He founded Awbury Partners, LP, in 2005, a family investment partnership with some 53 current members. He has served on a number of nonprofit boards, including 3 Philadelphia private schools, the Friends Council on Education, and subsidiaries of Temple Health Care System. He is a member of Library Company of Philadelphia, serves as the Finance and Investment Committee, and also as treasurer. He lives in Center City, Philadelphia, with his wife Carolyn, has 3 grown children. Joe was an early member of Friends in Business, which holds networking meetings twice a year for Quakers who work in the for-profit sector.
And not-for-profit.
Huh?
And not-for-profit.
Yeah.
Good, a few of those too. Good, thanks, Earl.
We all try to go, for profit. Sometimes we're not success. So.
There you go. Good. Well, nice to be here with you all. I thought, I wasn't sure both in terms of numbers and attendance and where all of your interests are. So let me say a few words of introduction and then we'll see where we go from there. Talking about the topic, Friends in Business, is at least a double entendre, as the French say. I guess the first meaning you could take out of it is the Friends in Business group, which is run by yearly meeting. It serves largely a social function. And I guess in my notes I had written down here, meeting for worship can be a lonely experience. Listening for the voice within each of us as a guide, as a mentor, as a companion in our lives can be difficult. Running a successful business is also a lonely occupation at times. Sharing our insights, problems, strategies, and dealings with others can be cumbersome and difficult. Friends in Business is an invited gathering of Quakers in business for a strictly social purpose. We meet 2 or 3 times a year to share a meal, hear a speaker, usually from within our ranks, and to share experiences and networking. The group is often as large as 40 or 50 persons when it meets, under the auspices of Philadelphia Yearly Meeting. So that's possibility 1 in terms of Friends in Business. Obviously, there is also, that precludes a definition of who are friends in business. That is, who are the Quakers and who are the Quakers, what do they believe in, why are they in business, how do they reflect their values in their business? And we could talk more about this beginning in a few minutes, but over 300 years, Quakers and the developing Quaker culture, beginning in Fox's time, was a natural for beginning to focus what today would be referred to as a focus group or focus groups on what is it that makes business tick, what makes business successful and not. And while Friends weren't focused, were seldom focused entirely on business in Fox's day, the ground that was laid culturally for the development of, particularly in England during the 17 and early 1800s, was very fertile ground for the beginnings of some what turned out to be some very big and some very successful companies. Roundtree in chocolates, Barclays in banking. There were several large retailers that were run by Quakers, and there were, I'd say there were half a dozen maybe 7 different principles that were reflected in how those businesses became successful and stayed successful. Integrity is first. Quakers came to be known as having a great deal of integrity in their business dealings, dealing honestly with people, and in the spirit of there is that of God in each of us, looking for that in not just their customers, but their employees, their suppliers, and those that help them eventually govern their businesses. So integrity, that of God within each person, continuing revelation, I think is another very important one. That is, just as with life in particular, life and business in particular, is ever changing in its dynamics. And rather than a rigid doctrine of belief in terms of religion, rather than a rigid structure in terms of business, one needs to learn to be more flexible and responsive to changes in both business and cultural milieu and conditions. The value put on truth and the seeking truth, I think was another big one. I've read some anecdotes about the beginnings of Cadbury and Roundtree, and in the U.S., Hershey, who was a competitor of theirs in chocolates. And there was a great deal, at the time, this is back in the mid to late 1800s, there was a great deal of rumor, skepticism, hyperbole, speculation in what was a successful formulation for chocolate. Certainly cocoa played a large part in that, but with regard to other ingredients, what combination and for what purposes the chocolate might be made were very different and varied from company to company. Cadbury, for example, was one of the first and became very skilled quickly at putting dried fruits into combining dried fruits with their chocolate. And that kept them successful for a good period of time. So truth, valuing truth is pretty important. That is, what became important to the successful companies was finding where the truth of the good formulas were and using them. The golden rule, I think also, it kind of goes to integrity and the importance of integrity. But the golden rule, I think, was an important principle that many of these businesses reflected. The sum of the parts can be greater than the whole. This particularly with regard to external relations, employee relations, relationships with your suppliers and service providers was part of that. That is, taking the ability to take 1 and 1 and make 3 is important. And finally, transparency. One of the things that business and business secrets early on were something that lots of businesses and managers of businesses saw it in their interest to keep confidential. And that desire for confidentiality in many cases permeated entire organizations. And that impaired many of those organizations. So transparency and keeping transparency alive and opacity in the background was very important to those. So one of my relatives, Earl's introduction mentioned the PQ Corporation. It was started in 1832 on 3rd Street, not far from where I live, by the Elkington family, and became a very successful company, and we sold the company in 2005. Thomas Elkington, who was part of the second Elkington family managing the business, in 1846 wrote some advice to his 2 sons, who were then taking over the business. And part of his advice was, dwell under a proper concern for the best things. Hardly very specific, but I think it conveyed a spirit of dealing with people and circumstances that I think is I have always seen as quite reflective of good Quaker business and business practice, as obtuse as it may sound in some ways. So that's a little bit about what Friends in Business is, and some about who Friends in Business have been. But let's see what interests any of you may have in exploring either of those a little bit more. Before I could, as I think I said to Earl when we walked in, I could rattle on about this for days at a time, which is not your interest, I'm sure. Certainly not mine today. But let's see what interest you have in terms of exploring some of that.
Well, I'm interested. Over the phone, you and I talked, and I tell you that I read the book 1645 and 1795 Quakers. Mm-hmm. And so what that was Philadelphia Quakers. Philadelphia had a population of 22,000 back then.
Yep, about right.
And they ran everything, really. I mean, the legislature in those days, I guess we could figure out what happened to the people in legislature because the wars came along. Mm-hmm. They take the opposite side type thing, or a pacifistic side. But why did we lose the desire to own businesses? What happened? And now they always say we're all school teachers and social workers. What happened?
Okay, Karen wants to chime in on that one.
Yeah. So those of you who don't know me, I have a degree in Quaker history from Old School of Religion, and I did a thesis on that question. So I tried to get the answer to that. And what I found out was, in the early 20th century, there was a movement in England by the Socialist Quaker Society, which were Fabian socialists, to get the yearly meeting, and the capitalists, the business people, and as Joe said, they were very, very prominent business people, to change their business practices to become more socialistic. And they succeeded in getting London Yearly Meeting to adopt what are called the 8 foundations of a true social order. And that put a lot of pressure on the business people. So the business people held this is during World War I. They formed a committee called the War and Social Order Committee. They're the ones that adopted the 8 principles of true social order. And it had a socialistic feel. So the business people got together and they held a conference in 1919, to try to see what they could do, how they could do that
This is in Britain.
in Britain.
Yeah.
At the same time, Philadelphia Urban Meeting, combined with both the Orthodox and the Hicksite branches, also were meeting. Okay, so this is going on both sides of the Atlantic. And they have this meeting in 1918, and they try to figure out what they're going to do. And they decide to do profit sharing as the way to do that. But that's a way to share the wealth with the workers, which makes perfect sense. And Roundtree had started it already.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened is that as the war ends, Britain goes back on the gold standard, has a major depression in 1921, and the country is, and there's strike after strike after strike. The country is not doing well at all. You know, the U.S. we call it the Roaring '20s. It was, you know, the Gilded Age. It was not like that in Britain at all. It was a terrible, terrible time. And Britain had lost its global dominance of trade. You know, because Britain had the colonies, but they had been barricaded through the war by the Germans, so they weren't able to sell to the colonies, and the U.S. had taken over. So it's a very bad time. And of the 18 years that the Roundtree profit-sharing plan was in place, they only paid out profits in 2 years. That's how bad things were. So the organization of the Quaker businesses gets together 10 years later in 1928, and they say, "What's going on? What can we do?" And they don't, you know, they don't quite get a grasp of what I just told you. That's a lot of economic research that I'm filling you in on. That was done by scholars over the century. And they recommit themselves in 1928, but in the meantime, there's fewer of them. There were 75 of them at the start, and now there's 50 in 1928. They meet again in 1938, and it's over by then. The group had dwindled in size, they had sold their businesses, they had closed their businesses, and one of the people in Philadelphia at the meeting who had been involved in it on this side of the Atlantic talked about how they didn't really know what to do. The 8 foundations of a true social order were very unclear for what we do. And of course, as I said, the economic circumstances were so bad. And so I think for my conclusion, my thesis was that the combination of the economic circumstances, the lack of clarity about what was actually supposed to happen, and I'm going to throw in also, I think that the business people were shamed because they were being told to do something that nobody's done, nobody knows how to do, and they're being shamed for not doing it because it wasn't possible, probably. Like I said, 2 out of 18 years is pretty bad. And that they were just embarrassed for, you know, having the profit loaded. And so when the businesses didn't do well, they closed it up and they transferred their fortunes into nonprofits. So the Roundtree Housing Trust in UK is a wonderful nonprofit that came out of the Roundtree fortune, and other things like that. So that's my conclusion from that thesis.
I think there are a couple of other things as well. Some of the reading that I've done, both in terms of Quaker businesses and other businesses, suggest that companies that develop successfully around a strong corporate culture, okay, particularly, I mean, as you go from an entrepreneurial business to something larger than that, managing that strong corporate culture of necessity gets more difficult. That is, managing more people around to be participants in a strong corporate culture. We certainly found that to an extent. I mean, after 7 generations with PQ Corporation, it began as back in the 1830s, 1860s. There was a very strong corporate culture there. By the 1900s, you were at the point where there was people recognized a strong corporate culture, but it was recognized anecdotally. All of their correspondence began with a phrase, not "Dear John," but "Respected friend." Okay? All of the employees in the business were not referred to by name, but by their initials. Initials were a great leveler in terms of social or business standing within the, within the company, and it worked fine. They had a PQ2 had a profit sharing company. We were one of the first companies in the United States to start a retirement plan for our employees. But again, those were symptoms of a culture rather than the root causes. And it's simply more difficult if your business becomes successful to keep it growing that way and still very purposefully focused as a Quaker enterprise. Much easier much easier in a small business. So that's part of it. But I think, as Karen mentions, we've been through, we're going through another one now, 3 or 4 cycles since Fox's time, of the disparity between business size and success and small entrepreneurs yawning wider in terms of economic value. And I think we're beginning to see signs that what has become a big wide gap in value is going to start to narrow again. I mean, not this year or next year, but maybe over 20 or 30 years.
I had a feeling with reading the book that, the 1700s and all, the Quakers wore the funny hats and the plain clothes and so forth, and I think the next generation rebelled a little bit against that sort of thing and packed off.
Well, it's part of the need for attention to continuing revelation, because the reason behind the hats and the gray clothing was that Quakers in particular didn't want to be participating in the dye trade in any way, and dye largely was sourced in Africa. A lot of it was slave labor or unpaid labor, and they wanted no part of it. So they developed plain dress. It also spoke to simplicity. In a rather obvious way, but that part of it worked. So, but as time went on and fashion changed, plain dress certainly became less accepted and less acceptable, even among Quakers.
Yeah, and the Quaker story is called that the hedge, meaning the hedge that would keep people to know that it was a Quaker, like a garden hedge.
Yeah, that's right.
And they say that the hedge came down in the middle of the 19th century, so around 1850.
Right.
That's when the hedge started to come down. And that's when you used to get disowned for marrying outside of a Quaker meeting.
Yep.
You could even be disowned for attending a wedding outside of Quaker meeting.
Jeez.
So it was your kid's wedding, your kid is getting married to somebody outside, you went to your kid's wedding, you could be disowned. And that hedge came down in about 1850.
I wonder too, some of those things that you're mentioning as an example, excuse me, are affected also by the population, how large the population is. When you have a large population, I don't know how to describe what I'm trying to say, but you can be a bit different how you approach things than when you're, and I don't know what period I'm coming pretty close to now when I talk this way, but as your population dwindles, you don't have the benefit of saying, well, you can do thus and we won't accept you in this fashion or marry this person or whatever. Is that possibly a
Well,
fashion?
actually, what happens is that as your population decreases, okay, so having a strong hedge has actually been found in other religions on that same Quakerism. If you have a clear definition of who you are, you're more attractive to people. But that stopped becoming acceptable, so people started leaving Quakerism. So as that was part of why the hedge came down, because they thought that if they took the hedge down, that they'd become more attractive, and that really hasn't worked. So it's kind of a chicken or an egg kind of thing. because, you think about some of the very severe conditions of belonging to certain religions, those are attractive to people because you're really committed. It's counterintuitive.
I'm speaking as a non-Quaker, so I can be aired very quickly. But let's take the Hicksite and the Orthodox, and at some point they had, some of them had beautiful meetings right next to one another. Well, this was it not possibly also because financially they were able to do this, whereas later on you didn't have the population or the financial benefits that could make that kind of, you make more compromises perhaps is what I'm thinking through here. When you don't have this larger population that has therefore more power, then when you, if I can use that symbol of the two buildings right next to one another, and after a while you can't afford to take care of one of them,
You might be more willing to make compromises in that situation, but you have to have somebody to help you go act as a bridge. And there was somebody whose name you could probably help me out with, who was behind the pulling together of the Orthodox and Hicksites, somebody famous, and I can't remember his name. It'll come to me.
I've heard different stories, so I can't help you.
Yeah, this particular gentleman, right around like the 1920s and 1930s, was very instrumental in helping the different yearly meetings that had split and coming together.
Elton Trueblood?
No, it's not on the true blood.
No?
It was somebody who was at Swarthmore.
Was it the, I was thinking
Oh,
more
it's
of
Swamp.
the Ivor Professor Rufus
It's
Jones.
Rufus Jones.
Rufus Jones, okay, all right.
Rufus Jones is noted as being instrumental in helping to act as a bridge across the two branches.
well, I'm sorry, I'm doing all this talking right now. As you mentioned before, Minal, there are people, powerful people, if I can dare use that word in Quakers, who have made changes, and beneficial ones, hopefully. But it still doesn't change my thrust here about how you can go through such radical changes. And there are lots of variables in your clothing or in your buildings or getting together versus, I mean, you can always say, well, this wonderful historic individual was very much a factor, like woman. But there is something else too. Maybe it's just a bunch of variables. But I guess I'm really hitting on the fact when you talk about even business, if you dare to say the word business. You don't have the finances. You're not going to argue these things as much.
I'll say that I know of a Quaker in this general area who is down to 2 people and they just kicked out 2 other people. I mean,
They what?
this meeting had 4 people and they just kicked out 2 of them. No, and their finances are in terrible shape.
Well,
So
yeah.
money doesn't always drive things. So
I have this, my opinion. I guess we all sort of
This is
run
my
into-
opinion, you say.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not an historian, but I've been working as a volunteer at Arch Street Meeting House for more than 10 years now, talking to the public. And the public asks questions, and then you're always going back to saying, "Oy, how does that fit in with what I'm saying? How does that work? What happened earlier?" And I tend to think that one of the things, this is maybe my rosy opinion of how things have changed over time, but when William Penn came to the New World and he'd been granted the land in Pennsylvania, and he founded Philadelphia on the principles that everyone had freedom of conscience. They could believe what they believed, that there was no more this English and European, you're going to be the state religion and that's what you're going to be, and if you don't pledge allegiance to the state religion, you can't do anything that's going to enable you to thrive. And one of the things that happened in Philadelphia, because people were attracted to a place where they could come and practice their own religion. And I'm going to say, there are other parts of history, the anti-Irish, the anti-Italian, the anti-Catholic, the all sorts of things, but you came to Philadelphia and you practiced your religion. Philadelphia very quickly strengthened in economic stature, and it was coming close to rivaling London. Well, all of a sudden, people in business or people working to enrich their own lives are going to say, hey, if this is working over there, maybe there's some idea here. And I think that's something that has happened through time, that people know Quakers sometimes only through the Quaker oats or Quaker state oil or whatever, which were never Quaker companies. But they were trading on the honesty and ethics of Quakers. And that's why they chose the names for their businesses that they chose. And I think of, it was the Quaker idea that it's one price. If a child comes in to buy a loaf of bread, it's the same price as if their father came in to buy a loaf of bread and was bargaining. And Macy's, I think, was the first large company that grew on that premise that there would be one price for everyone. So I just think a lot of our Quaker ideals have seeped in to the ideals of this country, even to the idea of equality in the Declaration of Independence. I think are Quaker ideals, and in a way, that alone took away how different we were from the rest of society. And I think that made it, less attractive. We were no longer the big flag wavers because everyone else was using the same ideas. Anyway, that's my little soapbox.
Joe, I have a question for you. I want to hear more about PQ Corporation, how it changed over the years. You said 7 generations between when it was founded and sold?
Yeah.
What were the different stages of it?
Oh, I mean, it began, I'll be brief, but it began as a soap and candle works on 3rd Street, run by...
A retail shop kind of thing? Or
eventually, yeah.
Okay.
But they had to produce the stuff first. So they produced soap and candles, distributed it through others, eventually opened their own shop there on 3rd Street. But they recognized very early on that their lot in life was not as a retailer. The second generation, Joseph Elkington, was a chemist, was trained as a chemist. Decided that what he wanted to do was to study the chemistry of soap in Germany. So went to Germany for 2 years, did that, came back and announced to his father that they had it all wrong, and that the way the Germans made soap was through the use of including sodium silicate in the ingredients. That is, tallow, the acid, I'm blanking. At any rate, sodium silicate was part of it, and sodium silicate was both an adsorbent, it absorbed dirt, if you will, and a cleanser. It had some abrasive qualities, and it sold like hotcakes. So they, again, saw their role as a manufacturer and a producer rather than as a retailer. So over the years, companies like Procter & Gamble became one of PQ's biggest customers. If you remember, a box of powdered detergents changed a lot, but if you remember a box of powdered Tide in the end of the last century, about 60% of the volume in that powdered Tide was sodium silicate manufactured by PQ.
So they actually got into manufacturing the sodium silicate as the ingredient.
And we sold the ingredient to PQ to Procter & Gamble. As it developed, sodium silicate had a multitude of uses like that. It was an ingredient in steel manufacturing. It was an ingredient in back to clothing, in dyeing clothing. It got into medicine and particularly into cosmetics for women. So the business naturally evolved as the need for products and product ingredients manifested itself. In the 1970s, we acquired a company that was, in theory, it was related. The only way it was related was that they used an oven to manufacture tiny glass beads. An oven, and they blew the molten glass up into a column, and what came down were solid glass beads. And those solid glass beads we all see every day, and particularly every night if we're out driving, because they're embedded in the paint lines that you see out on the roadways out here as potter's glass beads. Those glass beads, like sodium silicate, the glass beads started to be used for things like peening of the exterior of aircraft to clean them off before they were painted. They were used as small rollers in some industrial applications. So Potter's ended up being an acquisition that was well suited to PQ because of the kind of product it was, rather than how it was manufactured or distributed. So we got to the point in the late 90s, to late 1990, 1995, we did strategic plans and organizational plans. And what was clear to everybody was that there were no family members or owners who were coming up through the business who A, had much of any business experience, or B, were chemists and understood the chemical side of the business, the materials development side of the business. We had our own one or two internal, I won't say it was a management crisis, but discontinuities in management. And I think we came to realize that we were a bit out of water trying to run, it was then a $600 million company in terms of sales, and trying to run a company, and had 54 plants all over the world. Sodium silicate and glass are both very heavy materials. So because of that, you want to locate the plants for manufacture as close to your customers as you could possibly get them to reduce transportation costs. And we did that. But at the same time, I'd say indirectly it became part of our downfall, because managing an organization that was as that vertically stretched as we were was a task that we weren't adequately up to. I mean, we did it and it worked fine. But in order to continue to evolve the business, we really need to develop centers of skill and value added, in places like Asia, where we had no customers. We had customers, but very little in the way of infrastructure and that kind of thing. So we sold the business. I think, as a former director, I have heard no screaming complaints since the time we sold the business. I think everybody was generally happy with the fact we sold the business. We sold the business to a private equity company who certainly knew what they were doing financially. They dividended out their full purchase price within the first year. Increased leverage on the business from, we were levered about $1 of equity to $1 of debt. They increased that by 5 times. And before they then sold the business to another private equity owner, increased the value of it by about 4 times in about 2.5 years. So,
Just in financial engineering or management too? Or?
Yes. All of that, and more, and more. They made some they made some very good and very smart changes. They brought in a management group from the outside who was very experienced in the chemical business. In chemical businesses, they knew ingredient manufacturing and how both to manufacture as well as to distribute much better than we did. And I mean, they added real value to the, I mean, it wasn't just financial engineering. I mean, they added some real value to the business. And when they sold the business, they were not selling to a bunch of fools. They were selling to a bunch of people who also knew what they were doing, who took the pieces and split them up and sold them off.
So it sounds like what the company was really good at was identifying new markets for the same thing that they were doing and really being flexible and going towards that. So both the management
and new technologies. We had a fantastic research and development crew. They were great. And historically, two of them were Quakers, who were not family members, but they were incorporated into the business. They and others in management were incorporated into the business, treated exactly as though they were family members. And that was part of our success.
Was there anything that happened in the, say, 20s or 30s where it was challenging for the company? I just told you the history of what I found out about London meeting. It was going on in Philadelphia meeting as well.
Yeah.
Did you see that kind of challenge in that period?
I'd say during World War I, PQ was challenged internally because there was a big shift in the economy to get behind the war effort. PQ was not going to participate in the war effort, would not sell to the Department of Defense, on and on and on, and that hurt the company. As the economy came back after World War I, PQ did well for a number of years, but then the Great Depression hit, and the Depression was not kind to PQ either. Finding employees interestingly, during a period of chronic unemployment, finding employees during that period was particularly difficult. Nobody wanted to work near a furnace doing heavy work, on and on and on. That changed eventually, and then we were back in the soup by World War II with the effort there. World War II didn't affect us as much, and we had developed markets with customers like Procter & Gamble, customers in the steel business, other customers in the detergent business. That meant that World War II was not as difficult a time as World War I had been. So it touches on some of what you said, but not completely.
Yeah, but there wasn't any real rethink. Well, so when did they do the profit sharing and the retirement plan?
Well, the profit sharing plan dates back to the 30s sometime. I can't tell you exactly when.
So that could have been an influence for how it happened, because that was happening in 1918, so it could have.
I was going to say the pension plan even predated that.
Did it?
Yeah. And it was by today's standards, it was a pretty perfunctory pension plan, but nobody else had one. And that it was one of the ways to help seal the compact with employees. And they loved it. They thought it was great.
Because one of the things that was going on in England, which is behind the movement for the socialists, was once an unskilled, they call them casual laborer, lost their job, there was nothing.
That's right.
There was no disability, there was no social security, there was nothing. So if you got injured on the job, your family starved. And that's why the women and children had to work. They literally had to work. People would be injured and stuff. So, the idea that there was a pension plan or profit sharing was one of the ways that the Quakers attempted to get around it. So that's great to hear.
And brought them back. Yeah. I was going to mention, how are we on time? Karen, have you ever heard of a woman up in the Boston area whose name is Margaret Benefield?
Yes.
Okay. She's written some interesting articles. This one I picked up is from 2014, so not terribly recent. But this is an article from Forbes, and kind of comes back to the point that you were saying, Earl. Is there a future for Quakers in business? Okay, kind of. And she goes back over, this article is only about 3 pages. It goes back over the benefit that Quakers running business had, and what were the ingredients to success, and mentioned the focus of the meeting for business like approach to running a Quaker business. Everybody trying to involve all employees in decision making, at least in terms of and making what's going on in the business transparent to employees, and so on. And her thesis in this article is that Quakers and Quaker business have a tremendous amount to offer to big business today, because she also makes the observation that as businesses have grown in disparity in terms of their size, and big businesses have become so difficult to manage, over a large number of employees, that more in the way of Quaker approaches would serve many businesses well, but particularly big businesses who need to begin to look at taking a division or a department and treating the employees in that group, or have leaders treat the employees in that group as a Quaker meeting in order to help get the business done. And so I've heard similar expressions of interest. Maybe I've been listening to too many Quakers uttering them, rather than people who are in a position where they can really make a difference. But I think that there is some pretty clear evidence to me that finding ways of getting, I think Amazon today is going through, in a pretty significant way, trying to develop ways in which they can get more of their employees over on the side of the company in terms of appreciating and understanding the difficulty of running an enterprise of that size and scale and breadth, and doing it better. They know they've got to do it better. That's very clear. The means that they adopt to get that accomplished is yet to be determined. But I think we have some things that we could teach them if they were open to listening.
Well, you talk about government or workers' involvement. I was an accountant for over 30 years, and the last place was Maxon, North Carolina. And the plant manager had an open door policy. Mm-hmm. The door was open. Anybody, the lowest man on the totem pole, could walk in there and talk to the plant manager. And the last time that the union tried to sign up the workers and all, they didn't have enough signatures, and didn't even have an election.
That does it. Transparency.
And that was not the only thing. They had other things with it,
But transparency of the company to employees can have a tremendously beneficial effect. Just getting people information as to what is really going on. What's happening. Why are we having to close down or start up or what have you, is very valuable perspective. So
another interesting thing, if you go out to the cemetery, there's a lot of unmarked graves. Now, there's a number of explanations for that, but some of it is people that worked on these farms, and when they reached the point that it no longer could work, they weren't thrown out. They were stayed on, and they were buried out here. Most of them didn't have a marker on longer great what the name was or anything. But I remember probably the last one was someone who worked for Lou Martin. You probably did that. And he and his wife were buried out there. And you know, he lived on the farm over there, the same little cottage. And so he was just there, you know. Which, it's been transformed now. You know, the company had end of life financial contribution to the family, you know, burial type thing and all like that. I think it's like $5,000 in insurance and all. But all these other things came about because of the generosity of the company to try to compete with the unions and try to keep the union out. And it's
Well, I mean, if you think about it, a lot of the rising up of unions, particularly during the middle of the last century, I think had a lot to do with companies who were not open and transparent with their employees, and the function that the paid union folks serve is to try and first get that word from the company and understand it, and then translate it to the employees, which the company should be doing all along. Sorry, mine's a particularly slanted point of view, but no, I'm a great supporter of the idea of unions for employees who have been that are aggrieved.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem with that at all.
I agree.
But as an ongoing structure and part of a company, it strikes me that to the extent companies are unionized, it's a rather strong condemnation of the inability of the company to be dealing properly with its employees.
Yeah, very much so.
And probably on more than one level.
I have a question about debt and leverage.
Can I add something quickly?
Sure.
On that. Okay, so I used to be on the board of a national group called Interfaith Worker Justice. And the whole thesis was that there were a lot of really large companies, as you say, the multinationals, who simply made a lot of money, not paying good wages, not providing health care, and so on. And so part of what we found with the introduction of the living wage ordinance in Los Angeles was that after 5 years, those people who had been making barely minimum wage had more time with their families. There was a stronger engagement in the church community, and that there were really multiple benefits for the community when there were better wages. So we were able to see that just making some of those small changes in terms of compensation were really significant for not just the workers and their families, but for the whole community. So,
But I would guess that many of those same companies didn't have community-oriented programs that were put in place to be helpful and supportive of their communities. To boil it down to essentials, their position in the community was to be there to take advantage of the resources that were there and to turn them into their own coin of the realm and be on to the next thing.
Amen. I grew up not far from Hershey Chocolate.
Yeah.
We were close enough that in the summer you could smell the chocolate in the air. And we grew up knowing the benefits of a company that tried to make a difference.
Yep.
That really was significant. It's too bad there aren't more companies like that.
Amen. I couldn't agree more.
Anyway, so.
I wanted to talk about debt and leverage.
Yep.
So I have run into, as I've been studying Quakers and talking to people about it, I run into Quakers who believe that early Quakers did not borrow money. And they base it on something that Fox said, which is Romans 13:8, owe no man anything but to love one another. As if that means that you shouldn't borrow money. And there's another verse from Proverbs that talks about don't either borrow or lend. But what I found was that early Quakers developed a way to borrow money. But I wondered if you saw a reluctance to leverage up in PQ Corporation because they only levered up to a 1-to-1 ratio. They didn't really lever up, they didn't really take a lot of debt.
It was blissfully simple. First of all, we wanted to be in control rather than have someone in control of our financial well-being. But importantly, we recognized that the company's end markets were largely cyclical end markets. Okay, so what we had to avoid was the period in time where the economy or even a couple of significant customers in end markets their fortunes were in the tank. And we had a lot of debt obligations that all of a sudden we were going to have a hard time servicing. So it was knowing and understanding our customers, our markets, and what it could do to us. I would say those that bought PQ had the luxury, which we didn't have, of alternate sources of capital. If PQ's results went to hell in a handbasket, they had other places that they could go access capital, both equity and debt, in order to put back into the company to keep it alive. We would like to have had that, but we didn't. And we were not. PQ was not a public company. It was a private company, privately held.
I had a question.
Oh, I thought that was time.
Oh, no.
Okay, it's okay.
So our meeting, Woodbury has had some discussions relatively recently on what simplicity means in the modern age, because with like modern manufacturing and shipping and stuff, it's a lot easier to appear wealthy and have nice things than it was a long time ago, obviously. And there's sort of a fear of appearing successful, because obviously you can spend little money now and appear quite wealthy, or in some regards, and you can spend a lot of money and not appear quite wealthy. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on, people fearing to be successful in Quakerism and just simplicity in general in that regard.
Well, I guess life is a great leveler. I hear what you're saying. I was brought up to understand, and I've always considered the testimony on simplicity to focus around simplicity of spirit, and not to preclude simplicity of your physical surroundings. That obviously it is and can be part of it, but I think that the complexity that you're talking about, people becoming involved in, can easily become a distraction from some of the values that we talked about earlier, that are important, that are, I think, much more important in life than a car or a boat or a new suit or whatever. I think we meaning Quakers, need to be thinking about that part of it, and hopefully we continue to think about that part of it much more seriously. We've got, I don't know, at our meeting, we've got a couple of Quakers running around in Porsches and Teslas and what have you, and I would say that to the person, each one of those people is someone who I would say is relatively simply spirited. I mean, they're not wild, extravagant folks running around buying, excessively at anything. Well, one of them has 5 cars, though. But she and her husband have no kids and are car collectors. So I mean, of a sort. Well, it's a disease. Yeah. But so I hope that's helpful.
So I'll add that woman was sleeping in steerage with the sailors because his
exactly.
cabin had ornate carvings, and he was upset about the superfluities, and he didn't want to be there. So that's woman's take.
I heard a story, I think last Sunday, of I think it was a member was reading, what's her name? The Red Bank Battlefield lady? What's her name?
And
Whitehall, sorry. And apparently she was upset, or someone was upset because the benches had 2 slats, and that was too fancy. So, yeah.
Good, well, it's been, I think we probably ought to wind up, but it's been very nice having a chance to have this chat with all of you. I'm glad we did.
Thanks again.
Good, you're welcome. You're welcome.